I'm Dave Coulter, and this is the Lizard Brain Project. Joining me today is Dr. David Barash, Professor Emeritus at the University of Washington in Evolutionary Biology and a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Dr. Barash, thank you so much for taking the time to be here.
You're most welcome, Dave. My pleasure.
I want to start out, this is the Lizard Brain Project, and my use of the metaphor of the lizard brain has to do with evolutionary mammal instincts, survival instincts, which I feel have survived and adapted with us as our intelligence has grown and we needed less to adapt for survival. And now I feel like those instincts are directing us in ways that can be counterproductive, especially how it relates to the way that we are approaching climate change. And I wanted to ask you, what do you think of that metaphor? What do you think of that idea in general?
Well, regrettably, I think it's a very apt metaphor. I wish it weren't true, but I think to a very large extent, we are, I don't know if it's true to say held back, but we are constrained in ways that are troublesome, at least, by virtue of our evolutionary past. That's not to say that we are prisoners of our past, but rather we are very well adapted to a circumstance that existed for 99+% of our evolutionary history. And yet in that following 1%, we changed the world so much, and yet we didn't change ourselves. Not that we ought to have, there's no way that evolution could have done so. But I think that the big problem, in fact, I would say the biggest problem in general that human beings face is that disconnect between what we could call our biological evolution and our cultural evolution. Now, it's not necessarily that our biological evolution made us lizards as such. We're mammals, we're primates, but the lizard brain is a good way to look at it. It's a good metaphor.
The frustration as climate change is our biggest issue that we're facing right now. That is the frustration, is because we have all the tools to understand it. We have a 500-year solid, if not more, tradition of science. And so in that last 1% that you're talking about, we've developed the ability to understand exactly what's going on. We have the tools to fix it, and yet we don't seem to be able to do it. I mean, it's been in the public conversation for 50 years now.
Yeah, part of the problem, I think, and it doesn't explain all of it, but I think a big part of the problem is the mere scale at which our societies operate. We function now in a way such that it requires major decisions by large groups of individuals and leaders who are increasingly disconnected from the real problems that we face. If we were trying to deal with a problem at the level of the hunter-gatherer band, for instance, my guess is in most cases we would do pretty well. But when it comes to the problems of the whole planet at a planetary scale, we're really hard pressed to make those decisions in the right way. And it's not only a matter, I think, of the scale of the decision process, but also the scale of the problems as they appear to us. Because I think if you look at our Paleocene ancestors, when problems arose, these were usually immediate problems of one sort or another. A saber-toothed cat threatening us, or being out of food and the need to go hunting when we may not feel like it or it may not be safe. On the other hand, when it comes to issues like climate change, these are, in their own way, slow and gradual compared to these immediate problems that we're adapted to deal with. We're really not adapted to deal with long-term problems on a significant time scale, as well as long-term problems that are not affecting us right away where we are. As it is now, we are aware, or should be aware, of problems on the other side of the world, problems the other hemisphere, problems even 100 miles away. For the great majority of our ancestry, that was not of concern to us. And so to get us to respond to these things when they're not immediately impinging upon us, extremely difficult. People say, "Oh, it's cold out today," so somehow the intellectual knowledge of climate change, I don't call it global warming, by the way. I call it global heating. Warming sounds too cozy. You know, that problem doesn't seem real to many people if, on a day-to-day basis, things are okay. It's the difference between weather and climate. Climate is a prolonged chronic situation. Weather is what happens from one moment to the next. We're not
Right.
adapted to deal with climate. We are well adapted to deal with weather. We go inside, we go into our cave, we clothe ourselves in bear skins or something. But this is not that kind of problem.
The time scale it's the boiling frog problem.
Yeah.
But then, so we have that intellect. So I mean, that's the frustration, is that we feel like we ought to be able to think our way through this. And I mean, what does that say? That we are still so, you say, not imprisoned, but we're still so bound by those instincts, and that seeing the world in that time scale that we're evolved to see it in.
Well, what it says is that we've got, I don't want to sound like a real downer, but what it says is that we've got a real problem. It is our intellects, essentially, that put us in this situation, the collective impact of our intellects. Whether we're going to be able to get our intellects to tell ourselves to take this seriously on a level that, if you wish, our lizard brain is not responsive to, is a major challenge. And how to go about doing that is something that I wish I had more distinct answers or solutions. I think my own work has been intellectual, essentially. I'm a scientist, and I've dealt with empirical things and data and theory and what have you. My own feeling, Dave, is that at this point, and I don't want to be simply passing the buck here, but in addition to the need for politics and appropriate politicians to respond to it, and there are some now, unfortunately, there are others who are ridiculously insensitive to and downright opposed to these issues. But beyond politics and beyond the science has to continue, the politics has to continue. I'm increasingly convinced that what we really need is for the artists, the myth makers, the music producers, the theater people, the people who speak to that other part of our brain beyond our cortex, if you will. Could call it the lizard brain if you want, to get in touch with our emotions, a recognition that these things have to be done, that we have a problem and we need to change. I mean, I do what I can, and many others do too, and I'm sure you are as well. But at least my limitations, speaking only for myself, are that I don't do as well speaking to people's emotions as I do speaking to their cognition. Cognition is great, and we need to keep at it, and I certainly intend to, and I urge others to. But I'd love to see increased involvement by what I call the artists, the myth makers, the ones who speak to that other part of our brain. To get people. I mean, here I am, a scientist, and yet I want people to be agitated. I want them to go beyond their cognitive intellectuality.
Mm-hmm. I was just speaking recently with Joseph Mers from the Mers Institute down in New Zealand. I don't know if you've ever read
I know
anything.
of it. Yes, I haven't
He
met
just
him.
came out with a recent study that's gotten a lot of attention. He his point was kind of similar. He wants to use the tools of advertising that hit us in that way, that have made products and consumerism associate with certain feelings that we have about ourselves, and use that to reverse engineer what he sees that as a big part of how we got here. And so he wants to use the same tools to almost reverse engineer how we feel about ourselves, that to create a positive feeling about not consuming as much. I think
Yeah,
there's some parallel there.
absolutely. Yeah, and it's just the same fundamental ideas that we're talking about. Getting in touch with those. Again, I keep having to apologize, or I feel like I need to apologize. I'm not arguing against cognition or intellectuality, an intellectual cognitive
But clearly
grasp
it's
of
not
thought.
enough.
Clearly, it's not enough. That's right. And we need to get people motivated beyond that. I think in many ways it's like a contrast between the hare and the tortoise, if you will. The tortoise is our biological evolution. It keeps on going. It is almost unstoppable in many ways. It occurs more or less at the same pace that it's always occurred at. And then we have the hare, cultural evolution, which just zooms ahead. And it's been doing that zooming, depending on how you look at it, maybe for 50,000 years since, say, the invention of agriculture, but far more rapidly of late, where we go from certainly internal combustion engines, if we're talking about CO2 production, but all sorts of other things, whether it's population levels, weaponry. You know, we went from clubs and stones through bows and arrows and flintlocks and muskets, and now, of course, nuclear weapons in a literally the blink of an eye in evolutionary terms. So while this cultural hare has been zooming ahead, presenting us with all sorts of circumstances, opportunities for sure, antibiotics, for instance, with lots of good things, but also amazing, incredibly risky circumstances, like the increase in carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and nuclear weapons. I see those two as the largest, and then simply human population growth as well. I mean, our ancestors never had to worry that they were overpopulating, certainly not that they were overpopulating the globe. To some extent, there's evidence for local overpopulation, which eventually would induce some movements, some geographic shifts, which themselves happen slowly. But that's very different from a recognition that our planetary population is threatening the planet in a variety of ways. So I think if we look at the problem in that way, again, I'm not sure it in itself provides an answer, except to say, well, our culture got us here in conjunction with our very slow-moving turtle-like biological evolution. So our culture damn well better get us out of it, which I think is absolutely true. But I think it's a way of getting an intellectual handle on our problem more generally.
Some of your writing definitely goes into evolutionary psychology. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
So what are the methods of going back and trying to assess the psychology of, our earlier selves? How do you go about, making determinations about that? I've always been curious about that.
Yeah, well, and there have been some legitimate criticisms that it's all too easy to make speculation, to speculate that this, that, or the other thing has a adaptive significance, and this is what our evolutionary pressures from our evolutionary past, this is where they are leading us, and a lot of hand waving. And there is a risk of that. I think this happened more a few decades ago when evolutionary psychology was more in its infancy. More generally, I think there are two ways of gaining empirical insight using an evolutionary perspective into our psychology. And those two are, one, looking at infants. In other words, the whole idea is to try, insofar as it's possible, to look at what are the evolutionary pressures influencing us. I was going to say independent of some cultural and social ones, fully knowing that there's no way every human being, everything we do and say is impacted both by our genetic background and by the experiences we have all the time and that we've had in the past. So they can't really be separated. However, and they certainly couldn't be separated for you or for me or for your audience, but the further back we go in each individual's childhood, the more separation there's likely to be. And so insofar as we can identify cross-cultural universals looking specifically at infants, the younger the better in a way, we can get a sense of how our biology is influencing us with the role of experience minimized, not eliminated. It can never be eliminated. Every phenotype, everything we do and think and are is a result of that interaction. But one can get more insight if you look at younger individuals. So that's one thing. And
That's interesting.
I already used the word cross-cultural, and this might be the most powerful technique that's being used all the time now by my colleagues in evolutionary psychology, which is using what we know about evolutionary biology, make detailed predictions insofar as we can about what we would expect to be characteristic of Homo sapiens, and then look at examples of Homo sapiens from as wide a perspective as possible, not just undergraduate sophomores at highly selective American universities, but all over the world. Look at Inuit people. Look at the indigenous people of New Zealand and Australia. Look at Siberia and wherever, where in fact the under the cultural background is as different as can be, but the biological background is essentially identical. Not absolutely identical. There are certainly some differences if you look at different groups, but those differences are absolutely trivial compared to the biological commonalities. If we find behavioral commonality that exist despite immense cultural discontinuities, then I think we have a fair amount of confidence that we're talking about something that is related to our evolutionary background, the tortoise, if you will, that I mentioned earlier.
And once you see those commonalities across cultures, then you can start to wind backwards from there. You think?
Exactly. Yes. Then you can have a high level of confidence, at least. You can't prove, I mean, one of the things we know in philosophy of science, it's very difficult to prove anything, but you can establish hypotheses that can be disproved, Karl Popper. And insofar as you can disprove, you can eliminate some things and have that much more confidence in others. And so we do this a lot now with things like, well, a lot having to do with sexual behavior, having to do with male-female differences and inclinations, things dealing with parental behavior. Just to give a superficial example that's neither sexual nor parental, if you look at language, for instance, now human languages differ amazingly, remarkably, magnificently, wonderfully all over the world. And yet there is no human group that doesn't have language of some sort or other. And so here we have cultural differences that can be extreme, but they're built upon a commonality, a biologically given commonality, and that is, call it a susceptibility, an interest, an inclination, an openness to some sort of linguistic communication. So things like that, I think, give us a great deal of confidence in underlying biology.
Oh. So just to shift gears, I did not know until I started to research this interview that there was an Oxford Handbook of Atheism, but I discovered that there is one, and I was looking through your article in it, your essay, and there was something I wanted to ask you about. In the context of climate change, what I think is the biggest danger is the polycrisis that comes from it. There's been a few other words for it, but the idea that as we realize the situation we're getting ourselves into, and as that exponential curve moves to a point where we realize how deep we actually are, that there's a social breakdown that comes out of that fear. You talked in that essay about atheism, about the idea of our specialness, and that idea may be behind the reflexive rejection of evolution. And I wonder, I mean, as I start to see us questioning the social contract and working more, being more willing to go to the extremes to reject the basic democratic ideals that we've kind of taken for granted for several hundred years. That process, that breaking down of social norms, I wonder how much of that might have to do with our idea of specialness being challenged as we realize that these special Homo sapiens that we thought we are actually getting ourselves into a really big mess.
Well, the issue of our specialness, I think, is one of the things that, as you mentioned, the things that I wrote about that gets in the way of our accepting evolutionary, many people accepting evolutionary biology. We like to think of ourselves as so special, God-given, et cetera, and not connected to the rest of the natural world, which we indubitably are. And yet there are many people who find that insulting and troublesome. I'm not sure
So
what.
if we feel like we are these exceptional special beings, then and as we start to come to terms with the fact that we in a way have are outgrowing our environment in the same way that a bacteria culture would in a petri dish, given enough food and a boundary of how much we can grow. In a sense, I almost feel like that ecological overshoot that we are experiencing right now, that we have created, really challenges that idea of specialness, because we're acting like any other animal would within an ecology. And I wonder, it maybe even just on a subconscious level, I wonder if the fear that I see manifesting in that social breakdown that I feel like we're just at the beginning of, I wonder how much of that might have to do with just a dawning recognition that we're actually not as special as we thought we were.
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that, and I congratulate you for bringing it up. My sense would be, if anything, it's the notion of it being fear-based is an intriguing one to me. What I'm inclined to think is that the sense of our specialness, which again is so widespread and I think is very much connected to much theology, the notion that we were created by God in His image. And in that sense, I think many people have a hard time accepting the notion of limits because of that. Well, God is, if nothing else, God created us. God will take care. We needn't worry. It's all going to be taken care of by God. Everything happens for a reason. And so if we're cooking our planet, there must be a reason. That must be part of God's plan as well. So to some extent, I suspect then that the notion of specialness gets in the way of many people's willingness to acknowledge the problem and that they have something to do about it. On the other hand, I could think that the notion that we are special, if you wanted to retain a religious perspective, which I clearly do not have, but for those who do, um, seems to me one could make use of the notion of our being special and say, well, God has created us specially for, quote, His purposes, one of which is presumably to preserve that which He has created, which is not just us, but the rest of the living world, and we have a responsibility. And we're so special, damn it, we can do it. You know, so that in theory, one could use that specialness in that way. Um, but I think that the notion that that sense of theological divine specialness being chips off the old divine block, whether that leads to a kind of fear is not something I
I think our
consider, but I
reaction to
will.
climate has a lot to do with fear. I look at what my fellow humans are going through right now, and I feel like there's a lot of fear and in that uncertainty, because I feel like, and it almost feeds on itself, because I feel like we're seeing a breakdown, and we're creating a breakdown in response to it in a sense. And so that's kind of where I come back around to the idea of polycrisis. I think you've got multiple vectors that are all kind of combining in on themselves from different directions in this situation that we find ourselves. And I think at the end of the day, we're responding to a lot of fear. I think I think fear is what makes people be mean to each other. I think fear is what makes people, when you look at what's the root of evil, to me, I think it all trickles back to fear in one way or another.
And even hate and aggression comes from fear in many cases. Yeah, I'm not arguing that there isn't a lot of fear and that it isn't justified. Um, I'm wondering about how the sense of fear relates to our own, or those people who have a sense of specialness based on being chips off the old divine block. I'm not sure how fear is a result of that. I have a great deal of fear for my grandchildren and for their children and
Mm-hmm.
for in general and for all living things right now. I don't feel like I have that fear because I think we're special, except that I think we're special in the degree to which we're mucking up the planet.
No,
Uh,
I just think that if we believe, those of us who believe that we are removed from the rest of the animal population, who believe that we are exceptional, that if they if this represents to them evidence that we are not, then I think that losing that grounding, I think could create a lot of fear. And I feel like the way that we're reacting to this, some of us,
yeah.
certainly feels like what it might look like when you lose that, that one of those foundations of understanding who you are.
Okay. Yes, I think that's a really good point. And one could carry it even further. Many people who cling to God, for instance, and to the notion of their specialness, everyone's special, you're special, you have an eternal soul, and you don't have to worry about dying, for instance, because you might want to worry if you haven't been an absolutely perfect person, because it depends on where you're going to wind up subsequently. But those people who feel they have an eternal soul, and so when they die, it's only their body that dies. To some extent, that helps alleviate fear, and there's a lot to be said about that whole issue. And in fact, I'm working on a book now about the soul, the human belief in the soul, and how I think that's really quite nonsensical and yet very widespread as a way of diminishing fear, essentially the fear that when our lives are over, it's over. Although for many people, of course, as I said, there is the additional source of fear if we think we haven't been absolutely perfect people and are in good stead with God. So fear is certainly, in that sense, a very real issue. My sense is that in addition to fear, when it comes to people's examining how they relate themselves, how they present themselves relative to the world, there's also, unfortunately, an enormous amount of denial, and I think that relates in part again to that what you call the lizard brain component, wherein if we don't see it, it's not real. If it's not immediately happening to us, it's something we can avoid and not think about. If it's something, and here there are other factors here, not least is, well, we mentioned earlier the size of our politis, of the political groups, that sense of human individual, what's the word I'm looking for? Ability to influence events, essentially. If you're in a fairly small group, well, some big events, you absolutely, you can't influence a volcano erupting or something. On the other hand, other things that you can influence, you're inclined to do. If we look at global heating, there's not very much as any one individual we can do that has a demonstrable effect. And so being unable to do that, there are many people who develop, I think, a sense of indifference because they can't see an immediate effect. You can have an electric car, and that will make you feel good. And in the long run, if everyone has an electric car, we'll be better off than if everyone uses internal combustion engines. On the other hand, if you get an electric car, you're not going to see the immediate effect on the atmosphere. You will feel better about yourself, or at least you should. But because there isn't an immediate demonstrable effect, there's a tendency for many people to think there's nothing I can do and nothing I should do because it doesn't matter. And so, again, in addition to fear and a sense of passing the buck to God, for instance, there's the sense of a lack of effectiveness, which again is a problem that we have now, that again our ancestors had as well, but but as a result of that, they perhaps learned they were well adapted to ignore certain things that they couldn't do anything. Change of seasons, nothing they
Right.
could do anything about. And so, to some extent, maybe part of our response patterns that have been adaptive for a long time but are very maladaptive now is to conclude that, well, there's nothing I can do about this. It's so big, like a volcano erupting in the past, let's say, or in the future, that I'm just not going to think about that. I'm going to deal with my own little life.
And there certainly seems to be a lot of that going on, which then just makes me wonder, like, how do we get past that? Like, what is, if this is not just written in stone, that we're just going to go down this ride, I mean, what do we do about it?
Well, again, we visited this issue earlier, you and I, as we were talking, and I think again we need to. You talked about a poly crisis, which is an important consideration. Maybe we need poly approaches to this poly crisis, then, not least of which is intellectual, political, scientific. And again, I've been sort of beating the drum lately for the lizard brain approach, if you will, getting in touch with people's emotion. And there are people who are very good at that: the song makers, the theater writers,
Hmm.
et cetera, the movie makers, for instance.
Hmm.
And we're seeing some of that. I think we need to see more. We need more of your blogs and podcasts. And really, I mean, honestly, this is all to the good. Whether it will happen in time and effectively remains to be seen. And again, appealing to pessimism is usually not a good approach. My own personal inclination is one that I don't think a lot of people share, inclination of how I motivate myself. I'll mention it. In this case, it resonates with some people, which is I don't concern myself very much with ultimate effectiveness of these things, of my own activism, for instance, but rather I feel like I have an obligation as a human being to make my life meaningful by acting in a certain way, regardless of the likely outcome. I cannot say what the outcome will be. Here I am, one of 8+ billion people. I'm not so misled as to think that I can have a significant impact or even a discernible impact. But I do feel I have an obligation to do so. It's really an existentialist perspective, that there is no meaning in life inherent in simply being alive, but rather insofar as we are capable of establishing having any meaning in our lives, in your life, in my life, in the lives of those people in your audience, it's by virtue of what we choose to do. If we choose to behave in a way that provides meaning, then we'll do so, or should do so. But to think that somehow there is inherent meaning in our lives, again, this gets back to a religious perspective. Some people feel there is an inherent meaning in being alive because of God's decision in that regard. I reject that, but some people find that meaningful, and I hope that those who do would find that it's meaningful then to behave in a way that helps them behave in a way that is more helpful to the rest of the world. I feel that the responsibility we have is to behave in a way that creates meaning, because there is no inherent meaning in among the billions and billions of organisms that exist on the planet. It's incredibly egotistical to think that there's some special meaning in my life, in your life, in anyone's life. But if we live in a way that creates meaning, then we're doing something real. There's a book that Camus authored called The Myth of Sisyphus, and that's a fairly extended series of essays. But within it, there's a very small essay. It's only like 3.5 pages, called The Myth of Sisyphus, in which he makes the argument, if you look at Sisyphus, who was condemned to do something that is as meaningless as one can imagine, rolling the rock up the hill and have it go down, up, down, totally meaningless. And he says that he concludes with the rather stunning conclusion that Sisyphus must be happy. And the reason Sisyphus is happy is Sisyphus is doing his job. He's doing what he has to do. He's making a commitment and doing it. And that notion that meaning is something we create, that is not imposed upon us.
I think that's a beautiful place to leave it on. I really appreciate it. I love that sentiment. I think that it's all we can do is each one of us has to live in a way that we think contributes the most and creates the most meaning. Dr. Barash, it's been really, really great to speak with you. Thank you again for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thank you, and thank you to your audience for presumably listening.
Thanks for watching. To catch the newest episodes, please support the Lizard Brain Project by subscribing. Lizard Brain. Question everything.